very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's interactive session between the Confederation of India Industry, CII core group, and scholars from the Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. The ISAS-CII core group interactive session will look at the global business in the new normal. This is indeed a very timely topic as the world faces uncertainty in the backdrop of the current pandemic. COVID-19 is a black swan event that will have lasting geopolitical, economic, and social impact on a world that's already undergoing significant shifts arising from geostrategic equations, technology advance, and climate change imperatives. Businesses around the globe have to grapple with and adapt to multiple dimensions of the evolving pandemic situation and are constantly reimagining and re-strategizing their business models. ISAS is very delighted to partner with CII, one of our strategic key partners, in yet another insightful discussion. We are pleased to have with us the following distinguished leaders and speakers for this afternoon's session. From CII Core Group, Mr. T.V. Narendran, President CII and CEO and Managing Director of Tata Steel Limited. Mr. Chris Gopalakrishnan, Past President, CII, Co-Founder Infosys Limited and Chairman Exilor Ventures Private Limited. And joining them is Mr. Bharat Joshi, Director Associated Container Terminals Limited. And the ISAS team is led by Professor Tan Tai Yong, Chairman of ISAS and President Yale NUS College. President Tan took over the chairmanship of ISAS from Ambassador Gopinath Pillai in August this year. Professor Tan has been closely associated with the think tank since its formative years, and he was the first director of ISAS. Joining Prof. Tan from ISAS are Dr. Amithendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead of ISAS Trade and Economics Cluster, and Dr. Karthik Nachiappan, Research Fellow at ISAS. And today's event is moderated by a very well-established leader both in Singapore and India, Mr. Vinod Rai. Mr. Rai is a distinguished visiting research fellow at ISAS and was a former Comptroller and Auditor General of India. We also have in the audience members of ISAS Management Board, as well as other members of CII Core Group and representatives from several embassies and ministries along the business community. Before we proceed to the event, I would like to kindly request the audience to switch off your mobile phones, microphones, and video throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback to share, please forward them via this chat group. The questions will be consolidated for the panelists to answer later. Please note that this session is live streamed on ISAS Facebook page. And it's my great pleasure now to invite ISAS Chairman, Professor Tan Tai Yong, to give the welcome remarks. Professor Tan, please.
Thank you very much, Sitara. Very good afternoon, Mr. T.V. Narendran, President, CII, and CEO and Managing Director, Tata Steel Limited. Professor Raja Mohan, Director, ISAS, members of the CII Core Group, distinguished panelists, and friends from Singapore and India. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to today's interactive session. CII and ISAS has a deep and special relationship. It is a relationship that is as old as ISAS. For close to 2 decades now, CII and ISAS have been organizing regular activities in Singapore and India on a diverse range of issues. Among the activities we look forward to each year is the annual visit by the CII Core Group to Singapore. The group comprises the CII leadership as well as captains of industry in India. Session with the group provides the opportunity for us to hear firsthand their views and perspectives on socio-economic developments in India. This year, due to exceptional circumstances posed by COVID, we are meeting virtually. Notwithstanding the difficulties created by the pandemic in both Singapore and India, our two organizations have been able to come together to put an exciting program for you this afternoon. While the comparison may not be entirely fair, the strong synergy between ISAS and CII reflects the overall and distinct synergy that exists between Singapore and India in practically all aspects of our relationship. The countries are continuously striving to identify new areas for effective and fruitful collaboration. The discussion on the Singapore-India Economic Corridor is a relevant example. The governments of both countries, along with businesses, continue to remain engaged in multiple collaborative ideas, notably in the areas of technology, sustainability, and innovation. Businesses will face many challenges in a post-COVID world. While there certainly will be new opportunities, there are also several operational and functional challenges. The subject of today's discussion, which focuses on these issues, is most relevant in the current and future landscapes. For this year's session, we have a group of experienced industry leaders, public policy experts, and scholars to reflect on the roles of businesses in adjusting to the new normal. I believe the discussions will produce ideas and insights that will enable ISAS and CII to identify future areas of joint endeavor. We are already collaborating on deep policy research and its meaningful dissemination. I look forward to the maintenance of the momentum between our two organizations. In conclusion, I would like to thank the speakers and the CII core group members for their involvement in this session. I'm also grateful to the administrative teams at ISAS and CII who came together to make this event possible within a very short period of time. I wish all of you an enriching and engaging session. My colleagues at ISAS and I look forward to welcoming the core group in person to Singapore next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tan. It's my pleasure now to invite CII President, Mr. V.T. Narendran, to deliver the welcome remarks.
Thank you,
To
Sitara.
deliver the opening remarks, sir. Mr. Narendran, your turn, please, sir.
Thank you, Sitara. Professor Tan Tai Yong, the Chairman ISAS, Mr. Vinod Rai, distinguished panelists, friends, good afternoon from CII. It's a pleasure. And this is a tradition which has been going on for a long time. The core group of CII has been physically coming to Singapore since 1993. Last year and this year, we've had to do it virtually, but I think the connection and the relationship and the tradition has been going on for a very long time, and it's our privilege to continue that. My thanks to Professor Tan and Mr. Vinod Rai for co-hosting this discussion on the global business in a new normal. The post-pandemic global situation presents India with many new realities, and we believe that Indian business must and will take a stronger role in these global challenges. In many areas, Indian industry is already a key player, including in the battle against the pandemic, where our vaccine manufacturing capability, our pharma sector, and also the IT companies and many others are contributing very significantly. Amid the slowdown, India has had a fairly quick recovery. We had obviously a very challenging 1.5 years with both the wave 1 and the wave 2 impacting us differently. But I think the recovery has been reasonably fast. Q1 of this year, we've grown at 20% against a low base of last year, Q1, where the complete country was in a lockdown. And on an overall basis, the forecast for growth for India for this year is 9.5% from the IMF, and about 8.5% for next year, which together makes it one of the fastest growing large economies in the world. The other encouraging and interesting input is that a lot of FDI continues to flow into India. At an overall level, it is more than $22 billion for the April-June quarter, which is quite significant. And also more specifically, if you look at April to August, about $20 billion have come into be invested in startups. And that's double what came into India to be invested in startups in the last year, same period. India has also added about 27 or 28 unicorns during this year, and is now the home for the third largest group of unicorns in the world. So I think multiple parts of the economy led by the government spend on infrastructure, as well as capital flows into the startup economy, startup ecosystem is helping the recovery. From the government side, there are multiple incentives and initiatives being taken to encourage investment in manufacturing in India, because India does have a problem of creating enough jobs for almost 1 million people joining the workforce every month. So, so the government has a production-linked incentive scheme, which was announced, where The expectation is the manufacturing output will grow by about 500 billion in the next few years. This is focused on certain sectors, and we've already seen the impact of some of that. If you look at something like mobile phones, where India was a big importer, is one of the biggest markets in the world. The imports are today a fraction of what it was last year, and the exports has more than doubled. So I think we are seeing some impact of this. More needs to be done and will be done. The national infrastructure pipeline has over 8,000 projects with a project cost of over $2.1 trillion, which is expected to give a fillip to the economy as well. And a number of private sector companies are also obviously participating in this journey. The third one is the National Monetization Program announced by the government more recently, which is to monetize assets where the government has already spent the capital and created assets which may be underutilized today. And the idea is to have a partnership with the private sector for a certain period of time, where the private sector can run it more efficiently, unlock more value. And so this is again something new, and over $81 billion of private government-owned assets are in the consideration for partnership with the private sector. So there are many other reforms going on weeding out redundant laws, simplifying things, improving the ease of doing business and the cost of doing business. India has also embarked on multiple free trade agreement discussions. We expect trade deals with the UK, with Australia, with the EU and UAE to make quick progress. And this will hopefully help India plug in more effectively into the global value chains. So what are the areas which we believe are going to be the challenges going forward in the new world? One is, of course, healthcare and vaccines, and vaccination continues to be the number one issue for us all to deal with, mitigate the risk of a wave 3. And India is obviously vaccinating huge numbers of people. We've already vaccinated more than 800 million people, but there's still a lot more to be done. I think so. Distribution of equitable distribution of vaccines is an area which, to me, we're watching very closely. Secondly, the imperative of climate change, whether it's IPCC report which came out recently, or whether it's COP26 which is ahead of us. I think a lot of discussions on climate change impact is being felt because of the climate patterns that we see and the disruption it can cause. And obviously the discussions between the developed and the developing world on how do you find a more equitable transition path. All of us agree on the direction. How do you time it well? How do you deal with the socioeconomic consequences of this transition in the poorer countries? And how can technology play a role in mitigating the cost of making this transition? So I think that's an important area of challenge and opportunity. The third is the digital era is upon us. I think all of us have been accelerated into the future. I think this meeting is an example of that. So to me, in multiple ways, we've seen how technology can play a role. It's changed our personal and professional lives, and it's also going to create a lot of opportunities. And India is continues to be a base for tech industry, and more technology intensive sectors are setting up shop in India. The fourth is 5G and its impact on business, impact on data flows, impact on artificial intelligence deployment, and also which throws up issues around cybersecurity and data privacy issues. How is policy going to evolve? We've seen it evolve in Europe. We are seeing it evolve in different parts of the world because this is a new space for many people. And I think for policymakers, or for industry, or for consumers, that's something which is going to be an opportunity and a challenge. So these are some of the areas where I think Indian industry is looking forward to working closely with our colleagues and counterparts in Singapore. I think during our interactions over the last month, we've developed we've discussed many areas where we can work together. In our discussions, we also look at what is it that we discussed the last time we were there in Singapore, physically, virtually, and seeing how are we progressing on those areas. So we look forward to this continued engagement with our friends and colleagues in Singapore. New normal is certainly going to be different, but I think the Indian and the Singaporean businesses can certainly work together to build partnerships which can deal with these challenges. Thank you once again, Professor Tan, and for inviting CII and giving me the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Narendran. I shall now pass the session to Mr. Rai to moderate and chair the panel discussion. Over to you, Mr. Rai.
Thank you very much, Sitara. Mr. Narendran, thank you very much for this very insightful opening remarks that you have made. It will help us segue into some discussion, and we have a lovely group of panelists today. But we have to acknowledge, as you said, that the COVID-19 pandemic has swept the global business landscape like a tsunami, leaving behind a trail which impacts the geopolitical, the economic, and the social arena. Now, this has come as an event which will have a lasting impact on the way the world does business going forward, because the speed and the extent of recovery are questions that defy an easy answer, and you mentioned about it too. In fact, leaders like you have pushed strategic investments into new technologies and created new ways of working. The shift to digital models helped them navigate operational and financial challenges while rapidly catering to the needs of employees, customers, and shareholders. In fact, in hindsight, it may be safe to say that digital technologies have proven, and I'm sure Mr. Gopalakrishnan will throw light on it, have proven a strong case for themselves, and as per the prevailing sentiments, are set to scale up on a new high growth trajectory beginning from the first quarter of 2022. Now, in a world that is redrawing the shape of globalization, taking digitization and automation to a new level, and transforming markets, global business leaders have to navigate some difficult terrains, refocus and rebalance priorities, and be future ready. Now, most business leaders will have to make difficult choices about the future of their company as we learn about the behavior of this unprecedented virus. Now, organizations that have large workforces are in fact faced with a moral dilemma of asking employees to come to work, risking their health and that of their families. So business leaders will have to architecture agile and nimble organizations within which everyone is prepared to be an innovative problem solver. Now, as a large and dynamic market that India is, and it is set to achieve notable growth in the near future, the Indian economy will be closely watched and Indian businesses will be key players on the global business platform. Now, for today's discussion, the Institute of South Asian Studies and CII have put together a most distinguished panel before us. We have two industry leaders from India and two scholars from the Institute of South Asian Studies, and we will be exposed to how they perceive the evolving global world order. Now, without taking more time, I would like to call upon Mr. Chris Gopalakrishnan, the past president of CII, to make his comments. Mr. Gopalakrishnan, 3 to 5 minutes, your choice. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Vinod, and thank you, ISAS, for inviting us. I've been part of the core group from 2011 and have enjoyed the interactions, have learned from these visits, and this visit, though virtual, is proving it's happening the same way. So thank you for this opportunity for me to share my thoughts on how I see the global businesses adjusting and how global businesses will evolve in the future. First and foremost, everybody has touched upon the accelerator or the rapid transition to digital. This has implications on businesses. Those businesses that were able to transition fast have actually seen their revenues go up, and those that could not transition, those that involved significant physical work, got impacted in some way or form. So you have a clear demarcation between those businesses that are digital and those businesses that are not digital. If I take the example of the IT services industry in India, they transitioned to work from home overnight. In a period of 2 weeks, 4.5 million employees were transitioned to work out of home. No customer work or no projects got affected during this transition. In fact, we can probably proudly say that the global businesses continue to run because Indian IT services was able to make this transition and kept the global businesses running, because these are the customers are some of the largest corporations in the world, and their IT infrastructure, their IT systems, their IT development, all of those are work that is being done by the Indian IT services companies. So they continue to grow. So this is an illustration of how digital work can actually benefit from a disruption like this, because it accelerated the transition. It created hybrid models of work. So a corollary to this is, how will businesses look like in the future? Is hybrid here to stay? How much of the work will be delivered from remote locations? How much will be delivered at office locations, etc.? Does it create flexibility in the workforce? I believe so. So those companies that can creatively, innovatively now redraft or their policies on HR, create a flexible policy for its employees, will benefit from a hybrid work model. Many of the startups that I work with, in fact, almost everyone with a employee base of 20 or less, these are very small companies, have actually given up their office space completely, and their employees work out of home. They have occasional meetings in a restaurant, in a common space that they choose, and that is it. They don't use any office space at all. So they are actually benefiting from lower expenses. Now, the second point I want to make is the speed of response itself. We had to respond with speed, whether it's bringing a vaccine to market very quickly. Normally a vaccine development takes 4 years, whereas in this case, within 48 hours after the sequences were published, the vaccine was actually ready. The mRNA vaccine was ready, and it took some time for them to create a sample size for trials, etc. And the manufacturing took its own time. But even then, within 1 year, we had public use of this vaccine, including emergency use authorization. So the regulators, the governments, global industry, the academia, research community all work together to bring out a vaccine in record time. And I believe that has saved the world. Now, how can we take this learning forward? How can we look at how can we collaborate? How can we make such decisions faster? And there are several examples in the Indian context where industry, academia, government collaborated together, waived off regulatory requirements, waived off rules, made policy changes, improved collaboration to actually bring out ventilators, emergency responses when there was an oxygen shortage, looked at approvals for holding board meetings and AGMs online, virtually. Telemedicine really took off, and approvals were needed. So, for example, a prescription that is given on a digital format was not accepted by a pharmacy. So, government had to actually authorize the use of digital prescriptions to be accepted by a pharmacy. So, lots and lots of things happened at speed. Now, how can we take this forward? Because if a crisis forces us to react at speed and we actually make changes, I believe those changes are required. Those changes did not cause a harm. And we figured out how to actually work with those changes and live with those changes. And this is something that we need to take forward. The third point I want to make is about coming back to the digitization and the hybrid models. Actually, I touched upon this. Those businesses that had physical work, those jobs that required physical presence suffered during the pandemic. And so we have actually created some kind of difference or discrimination here. If your family did not have access to internet, did not have a user device at home, again, you can't participate in the services that you need to continue to live, connect with your physician or buy stuff using e-commerce portals and things like that. Online education, you cannot participate. So how do we address this in a better way in the future? And I've actually, from 2012, from Rio +20, I have been stating that UN must make a Millennium Development Goal around access to internet. I think in the future, in a knowledge economy, in a digital economy, access to internet has to be treated as a basic right. And I hope some countries will step forward to do these things. The last point I want to make is about the learnings from this onto the other big challenge that is facing the entire world, which is sustainability. Right? When a black swan event happens, when the entire world is affected, when things are disrupted, we responded with speed. I believe the issue related to climate change sustainability is as big or even bigger, and it affects every citizen, every industry, every person in this world, every business in this world. But it's happening slowly. It is like a frog in a boiling water, right? It does not realize that it's dying. And that's what I'm seeing now with the issue of sustainability. But how can we take these lessons that we have learned in the case of the COVID crisis? Because this crisis is exactly the same. It is going to have immense impact, negative impact on businesses, on countries. And you can see the number of weather-related incidents across the world. No country is being spared at this point. And the disruptions caused to society, industry is significant. But we are still not able to respond. We are not able to respond together. We are not able to respond with speed. We are not able to respond with science, innovation, research, solutions. And we still, in some sense, fighting and disputing in many cases whether this is indeed happening or not. So my points are, there are some fantastic lessons to be learned, which we need to institutionalize and take forward. And there are things that which we are not doing. There are things which we have not addressed properly, which we need to address, so that if we can go forward with a new beginning or with renewed vigor, we will have a better place to live for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gopalakrishnan. Thank you very much for drawing attention to this remarkable phenomenon. We probably didn't feel it, that 4.5 million people working from home in the digital sector could ensure that there was no adverse impact on the client's functioning. That was a remarkable factor, because that, as you said, kept the global business growing. And I think this is a wonderful idea that you've given, that this was a time when the response from all the institutions which are involved, maybe the government, the regulator, the manufacturing facility, academia, or research facilities, whatever it is, did come together to put their act together and ensure that the response was rapid. And I think it's an interesting comment that you make, to institutionalize as a learning this crisis response mechanism. And I think going forward, we need to pay attention to it, because this has been a great learning. And rather than starting all over again, it will be wonderful to take it forward from there. Thank you so much for those wonderful ideas that you placed before us. I now call upon Mr. Bharat Joshi from Associate Container Terminals Limited. Bharat is a representative of the young, the energetic, the dynamic, innovative, nimble kind of entrepreneur who is young and who's been able to rapidly change gears and get accustomed to the problem at hand and switch. Bharat, floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Chairman Tan, the very esteemed and very gracious with his introductory remarks, Mr. Vinod Rai, President Narendran, esteemed past President Chris Gopalakrishnan, my friend Dr. Palit and Dr. Nachiyappan, and of course, everyone listening in, friends from Singapore and from India. Very good afternoon or good evening to you. I'd just like to start by recognizing how well and very appropriately this panel has been titled Reimagining Globalization and New Opportunities in the Region for Indian Businesses. And what this does is it very correctly, in my view, presupposes both the fact that there are new opportunities in this post-COVID world, and also that not only globalization, but regional coordination is emerging as one of the key frameworks or architectures for really dealing with this very rapidly shifting and changing world. We've already seen a coordinated global response and cooperation, which has paved the way for effective treatments and also vaccines. And while lockdowns and border closures have sharply diminished global mobility, at the same time, trade has rebounded strongly. And as President Narendran pointed out, FDI investments globally have recovered, and as have digital information flows. We've seen in our own experience in India in logistics and the broader connectivity business that throughout the two big waves we had, COVID-1 and COVID-2, supply chains delivered. There were no shortages, there were no stockouts of any kind in India, thankfully. We also saw across the board, ports, and we still see this, ports are full, freight rates are a little too high. We'd like them to be more sustainable. But look, there is demand. So there is really an economic reasoning for this. The demand is just so high. But also on the railway side, for instance, the lifting or the tonnage carried by Indian Railways were at record highs. The transit times were shorter than we'd ever witnessed before. And this continues. While a lot of this has a physicality to it, also the digital connectivity, if you please, is manifest in not only the many reforms that Mr. Chris Gopalakrishnan alluded to, which made this possible. And we've seen this on the connectivity side, whether it's with e-way bills or bills of lading or other documents which had to be very quickly translated to a digital format, but also the huge boom in e-commerce and all associated ecosystems around that. So opportunities, of course, are there. We've also seen that the vulnerability of global supply chains was underscored. And also we received the jab in the ribs, highlighting the fact that shocks can come in a variety of forms, from natural disasters to geopolitical tensions. And we've sort of seen both in the last 18 months, both trading behind borders and beyond borders. Asian countries, of course, need to continually strengthen their supply chain resistance to future shocks. And one solution is perhaps greater regional diversification. And we will continue to see a reduction in supply chain redundancies, while also shortening of supply chains in some cases. So coming to our specific relationship, India and Singapore share a vision of inclusivity and regional engagement, and a global recovery will need a concerted effort by all nations. reconstruction in this post-COVID world. And I think there's largely consensus that this post-COVID world will essentially be a COVID endemic world, not essentially a COVID zero world. So, if we accept that, then how do we, join hands to fuel economic recovery, not only in our two countries and create employment, but also work towards building resilient supply chains and an economic ecosystem in the broader ASEAN region. So 5 key areas that could strengthen our cooperation for regional benefits could be manufacturing for leveraging India's potential as a strong partner, as a strong part of regional value chains, manufacturing chains, and connectivity. Infrastructure development, so the physical connectivity to enable India to connect with ASEAN region more effectively and in alignment with India's national infrastructure pipeline, transferring India's know-how in innovation and startup to other ASEAN countries, facilitating Indian companies to invest in ASEAN as a way to provide an alternative to investments from other countries which might have diminished, and finally progressing together on Industry 4.0. I look forward to working with Singapore friends in these areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you very much for drawing attention to these issues. And yes, we need to acknowledge that the switch to e-way bills and say switch to e-commerce and the 5 points that you have, brought focus on is very interesting, and that is contributed in a large way to ensure that we could manage business with good connectivity, even in the sector of logistics in which you have been working. Now, may I call upon the ISAS team? Can we, now we have Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Visiting Fellow from ISAS, share his views with us. Dr. Palit.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rai, and it's always a pleasure to engage with the CII core group. I have had the opportunity of doing so before twice in the past, so let me take this opportunity to virtually wish you a very warm welcome to Singapore. I'm assuming that we are hosting you in Singapore at ISAS, and I'm sure we will get to do that. This was in spirit, but was in person. That will happen very soon. I will reflect on 3 issues which I think are quite pertinent insofar as the interests, experiences, and challenges of Indian businesses and regional businesses are concerned. And these are all coming out of the changes and turbulence that has been experienced by the Asia-Pacific region, broadly as such. The first, of course, is the question of supply chains. But on supply chains, what I wanted to share with you, and this is something which, being a part of the industry, many of you are collectively and individually aware of, perhaps more aware of than mine. One of the realizations at this point in time, and primarily from a region which is very intra-connected in so far as supply chains concerned, the realization is that supply chain disruptions are going to become more frequent over time. And this is not just a result of the lessons that have been imparted by COVID, but as my previous panelists have alluded to, extreme weather events are becoming more frequent. A lot of unforeseen developments are happening around us. I mean, even if it had not been COVID-19, some of you might recall the flash floods in Thailand in 2012. Which had completely thrown the automobile industry out of gear, or what happened earlier during the Fukushima disasters and subsequently in many other cases. Now, there is this clear realization, and there are some studies that are also coming out to back the fact that probably every 3 to 4 years, regional businesses need to get prepared for facing disruption of a kind which they haven't probably experienced before in entirety. Now, this is something which makes the entire question of resilience assume a very different dimension. But at the same time, the complication has arisen from the fact that now resilience is also being motivated by the prevailing geopolitics in the region. And geopolitics has led to creation of new orders, and these orders are now being defined by business integrations between countries. So from government to government, the order is trying to move on to a B2B kind of character between the same countries. But all these pose a set of very serious challenges for the businesses, because it is one thing to anticipate what is very difficult to anticipate, but it is also another thing to assume that geopolitics will continue to remain a driving factor behind supply chain shifts. So how do businesses adjust to these developments? And some of the developments are already there to be taken. The Quad partnership has gone ahead and announced very strong economic decisions to cooperate with each other. India, Japan, and Australia have announced the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative. Now, there is this understanding that probably the supply chains around themselves will create a new set of economic connection issues, which will need to be thrashed out, but they may not be possible to be thrashed out at a macro level. They will probably need to be thrashed out at a sectoral level or at an industry level. And they all need to be prepared for the kind of almost quasi black swan developments like what has happened in the Ningbo Zhoushan port, which completely threw the container traffic movement out of gear. And these are unanticipated. These are unprecedented. Every event appears more unprecedented than its previous event. So this is a huge set of challenges that the SMEs, as well as many of the larger businesses, are trying to grapple with. And from here, the next phase of transition has been the engagement in trade. Now, this is very interesting that when COVID-19 first struck, and the data is there to show that the result of COVID-19 across the world was the announcement of trade prohibitions in a large number of countries, primarily export restrictions for very obvious reasons, ensuring domestic availability and supplies. But this, over time, has slowly faded into a situation where some of the restrictions remain, but countries continue to engage with each other actively in pursuit of trade conversations. India, we know, has been very actively pushing a policy of trade engagement. There are at least 3 FTAs, the United Kingdom, the UAE, and lastly, the one that has just come with respect to Australia today in the joint ministerial announcement, which are kind of into the top gear. And the others with European Union and Canada are in the pipeline. And if we focus on the Asia-Pacific region, some of these FTAs in their own way are also going to influence India's engagement with the Asia-Pacific. Needless to say, something like India-Australia FTA might be very significant. In all these, a country like Singapore will perhaps be implicitly involved in terms of its very strategic geography and the movement position that it occupies, both through the digital world as well as through the physical world. But there's something to be noted about these FTAs that are being discussed. And when one looks at the Asia-Pacific region, the ones that are being talked about, something like the CPTPP, for example, which has been there and is operational and now has new memberships being proposed, first by the United Kingdom, then by China. The Digital Economic Partnership has been agreed to between Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. The Indonesia-Australia FTA was concluded just before the COVID-19 hit. The RCEP has become functional. The point that I'm trying to make over here is that FTAs are being talked about, FTAs are being discussed, but the drivers of the FTAs are turning out to be a little different from what they're before. Firstly, supply chains are becoming very important in every FTA that is being discussed. Clean and green energy and finance and technology are becoming very important. Industry-specific concerns are becoming very important. Critical technologies are becoming very important. So one of the important things that emerges now is that the future FTAs which this region and its members do between themselves as well as with external partners might actually look very different from the FTAs that have been existing. In terms of their scope, in terms of their coverage. I mean, one of the pertinent examples could be the India-Australia FTA, which is being discussed, which is probably going to be a representative FTA in terms of being a truly 21st century modern generation FTA by itself in terms of the issues that it encompasses. And this is something for which businesses need to be prepared on both sides, because there's going to be a wholly different set of rules. Existing rules are going to change. There's a great degree of trade facilitation, upgradation that is coming in terms of new practices and new principles, and those are challenging. The last point that I wanted to share with you in terms of, I think, significant far-reaching developments is a movement that is happening around digital currencies. We are aware of the fact that China has launched the electronic yuan within the domestic retail space on a trial basis, but with the intention that the same currency will also be tested with a few other currencies who are engaged in the digital currency space for interoperability. Singapore, Australia, Malaysia, Thailand, the United Arab Emirates, and Hong Kong are variously engaged in talking to each other and along with the Bank of International Settlements over a large number of trials that might be done with respect to the digital currencies, the sovereign digital currencies that are being tried and tested, and to see to what extent they can pave the way for cross-border payments. Now, this is turning out to be a very new space and a very new game with different sets of rules, because this is something which is still now not a completely regional phenomenon. It is a phenomena which is confined to select spaces of business, but with a great degree of interest, because most of the startups, most of the new ventures are actually happy to ponder much more on the prospects of dealing with digital currencies as opposed to digital currencies. Needless to say, this has impact for the consideration and coalition within the regional orders, because the currencies might actually turn out to be the main weapons with which geopolitics might come to center itself down the line in future. And this is something which needs to be closely watched out, and I'm very happy to reflect further on this with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Palit. Amit, it's so good of you to have drawn attention to digital currency and the new business rules which will need to be architectured around the discussions which are taking in the FTAs and issues like that. Very valid points, because this business has to go forward, collaborations have to take place. Necessarily, the issues of sustainability will have to be built in. Thank you very much for those insightful comments. May I now call upon Dr. Karthik Nachiyappan, a research fellow with the Institute of South Asian Studies. Karthik, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rai. It's great to be here with so many distinguished experts and practitioners from CII and ISAS to speak and offer some thoughts on the geopolitics of trade and investment and its effects on India. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is talk a little bit about the impact of the US-China trade war on the Indian economy over the last few years, both predating and during COVID-19 and after. So in 2018, the United States launched a trade war with China. It was an abrupt departure from its historical leadership in managing and integrating the global economy. By late 2019, the US had tarified roughly $350 billion worth of Chinese imports. And China had then retaliated on roughly $100 billion of US exports. The two parties then signed an agreement to halt further tariff escalations in January 2020. But existing tariffs continue to remain as of 2021. In addition, the US also initiated several regulatory battles, including Section 301 investigations against China's trade practices, and using mechanisms like CFIUS, the investment screening mechanism, to halt Chinese acquisitions of US companies in several industries. The clear intent here was to hold China accountable for unfair trade practices, ranging from forced transfer of technology to to intellectual property theft and related practices. So how did this trade war, this broadside that Washington had commenced in 2018, affect Asian countries, especially India? There are two ways to think about this, right? So one is on the trade side. Trade tensions between Washington and Beijing have caused some manufacturers to shift production out of China to avoid higher tariffs. As a result, some Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, for example, have often been cited as winners in the ongoing trade shift. Some sectors in India have also benefited from the trade war, like pharmaceuticals, chemicals, minerals, and engineering. If you look at US goods imports from India, they totaled roughly $60 billion in 2019, which was up around 7%, around $4 billion from the previous year, 2018, when it was $53 billion, largely due to increases in industries and goods like precious stones, pharma, minerals, and chemicals. But this number dipped back down in 2020 to $51 billion. So even though there was a minor bump, which from 2018 to 2019, it did not sustain over the next year for various reasons, whether that's India's own economic policies, a different American administration, COVID-19, possibly other economic factors. I think that still remains to be seen. But it is, the evidence suggests that India could have capitalized further, given the sharp reduction of Chinese imports to the United States between 2018 and 2019. So in 2018, Chinese exports to the US was roughly $538 billion. And that dipped to around $450 billion in 2019. So even though there was a considerable reduction there, and India did capitalize, it did not do so enough. The second part of my thoughts focuses on investment. So apart from trade, we can also look at diversions in investment flows. So FDI flows to India, since this is an opportunity that India could also benefit from, as both manufacturers, firms, and global investors seek alternate destinations. And if you look at a recent countrywide FDI flows, that shows significant changes in patterns of inbound FDI coming into India. And I'm just going to show a quick table, if I may, for about a few seconds, and then come back to my my thoughts. One sec. Can you see this table, Mr. Rai?
Yes, yes.
Chinese investments in tech. Okay, great. So if you can see and here there's a distribution in terms of tech investments I'm talking about that's coming into India from both the US and China. And if you look at the graph here, so from 2016 to 2019, as China experienced a number of difficulties in the United States, investments flowing into India, particularly on the tech side, increased. And so if you look at the blue parts of this graph here, you see a progression. Whereas from 2019, if you look at this table, you look at a really starkly different picture, where you can notice that the American investments, especially tech investments from big tech firms into India, have actually gone up considerably. So firms like Amazon, Google, Facebook, all of whom have actually established partnerships with different kinds of Indian firms, that's all been coming from around roughly 2019 or so. relative to the Chinese tech investments, which have fallen off a cliff. Largely, I think Galwan had to do with a lot to that, but there might be other factors as well. So, in a nutshell, what you saw from the graph and the kinds of investments, FDI flows that are coming in from both China and the United States, particularly into the tech sector and their digital investments. What that means is that if you're trying to explain this story, this complicated story, in terms of Indian FDI, you're going to have to look beyond just purely domestic factors, like policies, like legal regimes, taxation, labor competitiveness, labor markets, and other issues related to workforce. In trying to explain and understand why India has been receiving so much tech investments and other investments more broadly from China and the United States in the last few years. What that means, to me at least, is that I think more than ever, geoeconomics and geopolitics matters. I think India is now systemically a large economy with dynamic industries and firms, particularly on the digital side, that can both exploit geopolitical and regulatory tensions between major powers like the United States and China. But though being nimble geopolitically can enable India to attract and sustain such investments, I think the extent to which India can leverage and utilize FDI coming in and benefit from them in terms of growth will fundamentally depend on dealing with and fixing existing bottlenecks, whether that's infrastructural, regulatory, or on the policy side. Because if you don't, then eventually they will then show up on the trade side, primarily through exports or trade and services that will generally lag relative to the kinds of investments that are flowing in. I'll stop there. Thank you again.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you very much for drawing attention to the bottlenecks that are likely to arise as far as India is concerned if India has to get into the FDI business in a large way. We've now had some very interesting and insightful presentations of various views. We have some questions which have come, and we have half an hour, at least half an hour, to be able to handle these questions. I've just collated some of them, and my colleague Claudia has helped me to do that. Let me take them one by one. Mr. Gopalakrishnan, it's an interesting question which is directed to you. So let me address it to you. That to hear your thoughts on how India Inc. is addressing the issue of skills shortage. Because on the one hand, whilst the pandemic has accelerated digitization, it has also brought sharp focus into the skewed labor supply and lack of skilled labor. Would you like to comment upon it?
Sure. Thank you, Vinod, for that question. See, the skill shortage issue is a very complex issue as far as India is concerned, because you have to look at it from different perspectives. We have about 1 million people joining the workforce every single month. And we need to ensure that the job market grows to absorb these people. They need to have the right skills. And what happens today is that the university system or the educational infrastructure that is there, not just in India, but everywhere, changes slowly, transforms slowly, whereas the business side changes very rapidly, especially with the adoption of digitization, adoption of tools relevant to digitization. The practices change, everything changes. So just for example, adoption of telemedicine in healthcare, right? Now, how are the doctors trained for adoption of telemedicine? It's training at work. The academic setup has not yet caught up with this transition that is happening. right? So that's a reality. And what will happen, what will continue to happen is that businesses will have to train people at work, and they're gearing up to do that. Many businesses now embed training. They connect with academic institutions to embed training, etc. The second aspect of skilling is to look at vocational training people for specific tasks, specific jobs, etc. Again, a very large program is run in public-private partnership between government and industry to look at specific skills in terms of carpentry or welding or things like that, or even advanced skills like using of digital tools, computers, accounting, things like that. Of course, it should be scaled up further, and that brings me to my third point on skilling. India is a very complex country. We live in the 19th century, 20th century, and the 21st century. The part that lives in the 19th century is the agrarian economy. 40% of the workforce still depends on agriculture. They are not literate. So how do we transition them very quickly to other parts of the economy, other jobs and things like that? It's a huge challenge actually, and something that will face all of us in India, and it's truly a public-private partnership. The second part of the economy is the economy that lives in the 20th century, which is in the manufacturing sector, which is looking at traditional jobs and things like that, the SME sector. If you look at 21st century world, this part of the job scene is actually compressing or reducing in size actually. Naren, in a different meeting, was just saying that in his company, the number of employees has come down significantly in the last 20 years, right? The factory of 20 years back and factory of 20 now, the production has gone up 10 times, but employ the same number of people, right? So that's the reality of the 20th century India, where factories are not going to create enough jobs and things like that. And so we need to again look at how do we create appropriate jobs and how do we prevent people losing jobs, etc. And the third part of the economy is the 21st century, which is the IT services and services that are already digitized and things like that. It's a small part of the economy, but it's a very robust and global part of the Indian economy. Very much in the first world in terms of quality, in terms of services, in terms of interconnectedness. Here the problem is not enough people are getting trained, looking at computer scientists, etc. And this situation is unique to India in some sense. China addressed it some time back, but now it's getting challenged to address the issue of how do you transition people from factories to services and things like manufacturing to services. India has to address the transition from agriculture to some other part of the economy, has to address the issue of manufacturing, and has to address the issue of services. We are trying our little best, but it's a 1.4 billion people that needs to be looked after. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you think this labor reforms that are being talked about, they've just been talked about, they've not been mandated as yet, to a certain extent will be able to address some of the skewness that we see in the labor markets, the things that you addressed,
flexibility is required because of the complexity that is there. We need to respond dynamically to the changes that are happening in the economy. We need to move people from factory floor to offices and things like that. So we need that flexibility, and people are not willing to get retrained, are not willing to, equip themselves to new types of work, etc. It's a challenge, and businesses do need the flexibility, and that means flexibility in the labor laws.
Thank you. Okay, now let's move on to another question, and maybe Dr. Amitendra Palit can address this because you have been studying the issue of RCEP and how does business industry, what have you picked up from the ground, view the withdrawal of India from RCEP? Now, given the fact that Japan continues to court India to come back to RCEP and the growing US-China economic competition, do you think that India will, or there are any murmurs that India might reconsider joining the free trade agreement?
Thank you, sir. And I'm assuming that I'm answering within the borders set by the Chatham House regulations. So
absolutely so, absolutely. But it is, I mean, being
live streamed.
Live streamed.
I'm aware of
Yeah.
that. Whatever I reflect on this is entirely personal. I think as far as India is concerned, the ship has sailed because RCEP is, for all practical purposes, a closed chapter now. And India made it abundantly clear that there were very pressing domestic concerns for which it could not continue to stay engaged with the RCEP. It has not indicated under any circumstances that those conditions have changed. So there has not been any subsequent engagement between RCEP and India insofar as that negotiating space is concerned. But having said that, I think what I alluded to in my remarks earlier, and what I would certainly want to emphasize at this point in time, is that backing out from RCEP has not meant for India a subdued response to engagement in FTAs. In fact, on the contrary, from the beginning of this year, India has actually stepped up activity insofar as engaging in FTAs is concerned. And at this point in time, India's FTA engagement calendar looks chock-a-block, completely full. And there is also obviously this point to note that it's not a question of India engaging more with the East or less with the East and more with the West or vice versa. I think India is seeking trade engagement carefully in line with what it wants to maximize insofar as the national interests are concerned, both from an economic as well as a geo-economic perspective. And that is evident from the fact that India is engaging with partners like the United Arab Emirates, with which it has not opened the fronts earlier. India is well up and ahead with an engagement with the UK, the European Union FTA, the Canada FTA, the Australia FTA were all consultations that India had embarked on earlier, but had suspended them for a variety of reasons. Now it's gone back to reviving the talks, and they all look to have started on fairly promising footing. So I suppose it is best left to the view that when it comes to certain specific domestic interests on which India cannot compromise, India will not pursue the FTA engagements if they come into its interests, and RCEP clearly was one of those. But insofar as other FTAs are concerned, where such moves can be taken with careful consideration of the optimization of benefits, India is very much an active FTA partner at this point in time.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Thank you very much. Now, Bharat, considering the fact that you're on logistics and obviously are very close to the ground as far as manufacturing and other businesses go, this is a question, may I address it to you, which says, how has the Make in India initiative impacted the manufacturing industry, so largely businesses in India? Would you be able to throw some light on it?
Thank you, sir. So you're right in very correctly sensing that while we might be a little bit removed from the very stratified economic data that Amitendra would spend his weekends poring over, but what we do is we see if the warehouse is full or not. We see if the trucks are coming and going out. We see if the ships are sailing or not, or whatever. The sense that we have is that the numbers do reflect indeed a very authentic picture of increased manufacturing as well as increased consumption. And this is across the board. This is domestic economic consumption, sort of trade flows and also cross-border. One easy number, just to give us, sort of a quick sense of what's going on. I think it was only about a month ago when Prime Minister Modi, sort of unleashed this new program or a challenge for a $400 billion export target. And already in the first 6 odd months of this financial year, we're close to the halfway mark. So all indications are that we will hit that target of 400 billion within this year. So that's just export. Also, sorry for repeating some of the points made by President Narendran, but this PLI scheme, which really is an incentive for both foreign and Indian manufacturers to scale. And PLI essentially is the production linked incentive scheme. So of course, the production really has to be of that scale and investment and so on to merit that. So we are seeing indeed a huge spurt in manufacturing consumption, and and of course we also feel that on the logistics end of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bharat. I knew that you were not directly in it, but considering the fact that you move all the businesses, you would have a jolly good idea of it. Karthik, this question is addressed to you. That China has started to crack down on technology industry and cryptocurrencies platforms. Would this lead investors to shift focus to India tech industry instead? How would this impact Chinese investment into Indian tech sectors? You have drawn, your graph drew attention towards it, and that's why this question is directed towards you, Karthik.
Yes, I think there's a lot happening in China on the technology side. If you read the reporting and the research coming out, it's less a technology issue than an issue of economic and political restructuring, right? From what we have heard so far, the technology firms have amassed so much power in China that the government is now clearly competing with them in terms of having substantial clout over what happens, right? This is more than just governing how these tech companies like Alibaba and others operate. I think this is fundamentally about what the role of the state is in China and how much power the state has over these tech firms going ahead. And I think it's a case where the government is trying to reimpose or reclaim authority that they have felt that they've lost to these tech companies over the last decade or so. Will that mean more investment coming into India? I think possibly. It depends on how open the current government is towards that as well. There's been talks on instituting some sort of a investment screening mechanism in Delhi to better manage and regulate how decisions are being made, especially in terms of investments coming in from China and their security implications. I think that really does need more attention, especially from the governmental side. But the other thing I would also probably just add there is you're also seeing the US and especially the Department of Commerce in the US now under the Biden administration that's more keen to engage with China after a few years of acrimony. And you see the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, now making some overtures to the Chinese government and the Chinese private sector, including the tech industry, to reestablish the links that had been lost. Now, if you look at the data that I showed, a lot of the kind of Chinese investment that flowed in to India, especially on the tech side from 2015, 2016 onward, was largely because of the regulatory challenges and difficulties that they faced in the US, right? And now if that changes, if they are seeing a little bit more, if certain Chinese companies, especially tech companies, are seeing more, are able to work with the United States going ahead, then I think that will also change their dynamic in investing in India going ahead.
There is a very interesting observation which has come, which says that, Karthik talked about the FDI inflow data for India, which has seen a historic surge. But a closer look, a granular look at this data indicates that this has largely been driven by foreign portfolio investments and not really by direct capital investments. Now, given that the situation would require greater amount of capital investments, what can be done to ensure that the situation can be flipped around? Anybody would like to address this? I find Mr. Narendran has been good enough to be with us. Would you like to take a crack at this? Because you're right at the top and you can get a jolly good idea for what these inflows are, the hot money which keeps moving out and coming in at will.
Yeah. So, if you look at investments, I'll start at the investment side, right? If you look at where has private sector investments shrunk? So one is government investments and secondly, private sector investments. Government investments have actually continued to grow as the government focuses on infrastructure. Private sector investment, if you really look at the last 10, 12 years, the maximum amount of investments happened in power sector and steel sector. Okay. And these are sectors which have struggled over the last 10 years. And most of the IBC cases, as we call them, the bankruptcy cases which have gone were all from power sector and steel sector. So there's a bit of a churn going on there. Private sector investments comes in when 2-3 things happen, right? Firstly, there has to be a growth of demand. Secondly, there has to be a growth of profitability because a lot of these sectors were highly leveraged. So investments were not coming in because the debt was very high on the balance sheets as well. So what we are seeing is over the last 2-3 years, and particularly over the last year, more and more of these capital intensive sectors, at least for metals, I can say that, they're seeing the capacity utilization increase. There's been a churn in the sector. The financially weaker companies have gone into bankruptcy. You can argue that some of the bigger companies have become bigger. So there's a consolidation of the industry. But private sector investment is coming back. So even if I look at the steel sector, for instance, between all the big steel companies in India, about $15 billion of investments have been announced to increase steel capacity over the next 2-3 years. Power, the investments are going differently. You're no longer building power plants like you used to build 10 years back. It's more about renewable energy sources. The third sector where the investment actually is happening is also chemicals. So there are very specific sectors. Now, if you look at consumer goods and even automobiles for that matter, the amount of investment is not so significant to drive the to move the needle much. The other area where a lot of investments are happening in India is where Bharat is working, in logistics, supply chains, warehousing, because that's being driven by the e-commerce and deliveries happening across the country. So I do believe that private sector investment, or rather investment, is flowing into the ground. A lot of it, obviously, when you look at the overall pictures, the FPI, the portfolio investments maybe dilute the impact of investments on the ground. But I've certainly seen investments happening in the last few months, or announcements happening from private sector, which I've not seen for 5 years. Because even leading to the pandemic, actually consumption in India was dropping, because we had multiple challenges to deal with, the formalization of the economy, demonetization. Auto sector was struggling because of a lot of mining reforms, and infrastructure investments had not yet started kicking in. So going on, actually the recovery had started happening just before the pandemic. The numbers were improving in the 6 months before the pandemic. The pandemic derailed that progress. And now I think we are back to where we were before the pandemic. So I'm more optimistic about investments flowing in. FPIs, yes, are coming in. As I said, a lot of money is also flowing into the startup ecosystem, which is not going to translate into capital investments. Yeah.
And you think these investments in the manufacturing sector, as it is poised in India after the pandemic, the way it's taking off, is capable of addressing the sustainability issues that we are likely to confront in the days going forward, years going forward? Because that is going to become a large issue, a critical issue for all.
Are you talking of climate change? Are you talking of climate change?
Climate change, exactly. Yeah.
That's going to open up a lot of opportunities for investment as well. I mean, India has not even started investing in the hydrogen economy. If you look at what's happening in Europe, there's already a lot of investments in building the hydrogen infrastructure. It's not just about making hydrogen. Just like in India, the investments are going on in making sure gas is available in different parts of the country, right? There are a lot of investments in gas pipelines, right? In Europe, they're talking of building the hydrogen infrastructure. So as India grows, as well as wants to have greener growth, I think there's a lot of opportunity to invest in infrastructure which is not there today, but is very important for a sustainable growth. So I think it will disrupt industries. It will impact some of the investments already made, but will create more opportunities, in my view.
Oh, lovely. Bharat, you have your hand up. Would you like to add to what
Yes,
Mr. Narendran has said about these issues?
So very briefly, so on this question of FDI versus FPI, I of course don't have visibility to the data that is being quoted here, but anecdotally, my sense is that while the capital markets, both equity and bond markets, have really matured and deepened in the recent past, and that's of course also manifest in the huge amount of FPI we are witnessing here, but also FDI, just genuine FDI into new projects or new companies is also huge. So anecdotally, Delhi is now getting a second airport at Jewar, and Zurich Airport, of course, is the major promoter of that project, and that alone is several billion US. Then, in addition to this, the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which is new projects plus all the industrial corridor and other projects which you're well aware of in India. Very famously, Samsung has moved most of its regional manufacturing to India within the last 1 year or so. Apple is doing the same, and several others. So the sense I have is that it's maybe not entirely accurate that most FDI is indeed FPI. I think there's a bit of both, and it shows deepening of capital market as well as manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you for that insight. Mr. Gopalakrishnan, Chris, while you're still there, could you help us with this, that there have been reports of digitization with Chinese characteristics following the surge in Beijing's expansion of tech deals with the Middle East. How would India as a prominent software or tech player compete with China in the tech boom in the Middle East, specifically?
So there are two ways we would compete. One is, on the products and the software as a service space. A lot of Indian products are now being used around the world, and we have a growing number of product companies emerging out of India. One you heard recently through the listing they did on US exchange, that is Freshworks, a successful product company from Chennai, competing with Salesforce, and it's doing very well, and it just had a listing, and that's being used around the world, including Middle East. Another software product is in the space of logistics, especially cargo movement in airports and things like that. Again, that product is an Indian product. On the banking side, many of the leading products are again from India. Many of the banks in the Middle East use Indian software product, banking software from Infosys, TCS, etc. So first is Indian software products being used around the world and including in the Middle East. The second, which is an emerging area, is the way the Indian digital economy is being architected. Now, if you look at how India has architected its fintech space, it created the infrastructure that is necessary as public goods, the UID, the Unified Payment Interface, and on top of that, they allowed private innovation to happen. I would submit that UPI is a wonderful piece of software that could be exported to the world because it's truly world-class and very low-cost, real-time way to actually interconnect the financial services sector. It's connected to all the banks, it's connected to all the merchants, and it's a fantastic way of actually building the digital infrastructure that's completely interoperable and low cost, which is very, very important for us to consider. Now, India has announced the National Digital Health Mission. India has announced the education grid. So the model that India is adopting is to build the infrastructure, technology infrastructure, as a public-private partnership with interoperability, with access, with cost in mind, and allow innovation to happen on top of that. This actually is a wonderful way for us to export our models, our products, and our architectures to rest of the world, including Middle East. And I would request everybody to study this if they have not already looked at it. One other point I want to make: UID is now made open source. It's called MOSIP, Open Source Identity Program. Now that software is being looked at Philippines. That's being looked at Morocco. Indonesia is looking at. World Bank supports it. Several philanthropic organizations support it, and that's being exported to around the world, actually. So I strongly believe that we are at the beginning of a new wave of digital products coming out of India with the FDI everybody talked about. It'll get well funded. It'll get well supported. It's actually architected for the 21st century for 100% of the world. The software that comes out of developed countries only supports 10% of the world, the developed world, the rich world. The software that comes out of India supports 100% of the world and more relevant to the world than the software that comes out of the developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for that. Well, we still have a few questions. May I take up the last question, because I'm being reminded that we're running out of time. Karthik, this is addressed to you, and maybe you take 60 seconds to answer this. How concerned is Singapore about the geopolitical tensions between India and China, and more recently with the Quad and AUKUS? We continue to see Singapore being a magnet for Chinese investment and close political engagement. That's Belt and Road. Do you anticipate an indirect fallout of these factors on Singapore's engagement with India?
That's a big question.
It's a big question, yes. I think you can also address it in another 30 seconds.
I think the kind of fundamental strategic question that Singapore is worried about is the relationship between the US and China, and how they manage their strategic alignment, their rebalancing, and the recalibration. And I think, especially since last week with AUKUS and the Quad, the US-China relationship is perhaps more front and center for the Singaporeans than is the India-China relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that Singapore is not worried about India-China tensions, but not to the level that they worry about US-China tensions. Will that have an indirect fallout on Singapore's engagement in India? I think it's possible. Interestingly, and I'm just going to throw out a number here. If you look at I think for many, many years, Singapore has been one of the kind of leading investors in India, or sources of investment in India. But over the last 2-3 years, since 2018 or so, that's been dipping. And we're still trying to figure out why that is. Is that because of connections and ties with China or with Chinese investors and Chinese firms? We still don't know. So could there be an indirect fallout? Yes, possibly, but it's not precipitous. So I think Singapore will continue to be directly engaged and involved in India and the Indian economy going ahead, and we should expect that to remain.
Amitendo, would you like to add 30 seconds to this as a China watcher?
I would argue that when it comes to the question of relationships, relationships between Singapore and India have reached a level of maturity and stability over the last 20-25 years, which really are not going to be affected by what happens between other extra major powers in a global sense. And I think India understands the fact that China is one of the largest exporters of capital across the world. So it will be exporting capital to many parts of the world, including its neighborhood. And at the same time, Singapore is perfectly conscious of the opportunities that a country like India presents, and also a country like China presents. So I think there's not going to be any direct impact of that kind of a tension. Rather, what I think Singapore might be a little bit more perturbed over is that when the economic arrangements between countries, particularly around supply chains, start getting organized into different groups of countries, and for a country like Singapore, which focuses very heavily upon staying externally engaged for its businesses, the challenge for its businesses come that much more difficult, because they need to align with many different sets of rules and standards and so on and so forth. So I don't really think it's a geopolitical challenge for Singapore. It's more a question of trying to align with the regulations and standards which the current geopolitical situation might produce.
Thank you, Amitendra. It's really been a wonderful, very vibrant and insightful discussion. I wish we had another half an hour, 45 minutes. We could have taken this forward because there was so many more interesting issues. And every day the situation is turning around and throwing up very interesting forwards. But well, we have to conform to time. And I know each one of you are very busy and have further issues to attend to. I take this opportunity to thank Mr. Narendran. You are in the midst of discussions there. You are engaged with the minister and the team there. But thank you very much for lending your support to this dialogue today. You have helped us keep up this tradition of the CII with ISAS. And thank you. It's good. Thank God it was some kind of a virtual event. Otherwise, with you being in Dubai, you wouldn't have been able to participate with us today if we had been in Singapore, addressing this in Singapore. Mr. Chris Gopalakrishnan, thank you very much for your insights, for sharing your views with us, for addressing some of the issues that were raised by the audience. It was delightful to have you and to have your experience address those issues. Bharat, as I said, a young upcoming entrepreneur, has been closely working with ISAS and has been lending his insightful kind of experiences, sharing them with us. Bharat, thank you very much for taking time off to be with us. Of course, Professor Tan Tai Yong, one of our own, our new chairman, who has been a very keen India watcher in a large number of ways. He was good enough to be with us throughout this discussion, and has invited all of us to be in Singapore next year. It's been wonderful. Professor Tan Tai Yong, thank you for being with us. Amitendra and Karthik, our very own, as usual, as resource persons, and for people who have been keeping a watch on this entire sector, thank you very much for being with us today and helping us with your experiences, with your research, with the insights and the knowledge that you have in the sector. Sitara, thank you very much for organizing this. Jordan, Claudia, everybody from the ISAS staff who has made this a lovely event where a lot of participation, a lot of quality participation from those who have done it all themselves, which means industry leaders and our very own academics. Can we close it now? Sitara, you have anything to add?
Thank you, Vinod, for moderating very well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We can close, but before that, Mr. Rai, we also want to thank CII once again, for partnering this event, and special thanks to Kargi Pawa for coordinating this event with ISAS. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at upcoming events.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day and stay safe.
Bye.